Hello and welcome. My name is Lea Gimpel. I'm the Director of AI and Country Engagement at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, and I'm your moderator of this session. And we're going to talk about digital republic goods, putting the next generation in charge. And as you can see, digital public goods, it's in the name of my organization, it's in the name of the title, so that's what we are going to discuss in the next 60 minutes. And more concretely, we are going to discuss about how DPGs can foster self-determination, the window of opportunity that the Global Digital Compact represents, and actionable steps to strengthen the DPG ecosystem. And I already said DPG, I'm going to explain in a minute what this means. But before I'm going to do that, I would like to introduce also my esteemed panel that is here with me. So first one up here is Katharina Menz. She joined the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2012 as a spokesperson and press officer, and had this role for 7 years. And after this, she became the deputy head of the BMZ's parliamentary unit. And she currently holds the position of deputy head of the ministry's division for digital technologies. And prior to this, Katharina worked for more than 10 years as a TV news journalist, editor, and political correspondent in Berlin. Welcome, Katharina. Then we have Sunita Krote. She leads the ventures team within UNICEF's Office of Innovation and co-founded its venture fund that provides seed funding. And that was the first in the UN system. UNICEF Ventures explores how emerging technologies can accelerate results for the most marginalized children, including through investments in open source technologies from emerging markets. And last but not least, we have here Antonella Perrone. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Xcabit, an Argentinian startup that is backed by UNICEF that combines the power of blockchain technology with humanitarian efforts. And with a background in civil engineering and corporate finance from her time at Deloitte, Antonella is very passionate about the transformative potential of blockchain technology to solve global issues. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here with me. So let's dive right into it. As I said, DPGs are the topic of this discussion. Who knows what DPGs are? Can I see a quick show of hands? Okay, great. So there are a few of you who are familiar with the term, others might not be, so I will quickly unpack it before I will pass it on to my panelists. So digital public goods defined by the United Nations are open source software, open AI systems, open data, and open content collections. And what they have in common is that they are relevant for the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as that they do no harm by design. And in a nutshell, you could say that every digital public good is open source, but not every open source product is a digital public good. And the DPG's history is actually quite short, so to say. So it started in 2019 as a concept that was defined in the UN High-Level Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, that basically highlighted and urged the private sector, the governments, as well as civil society to work together to promote open source technologies as a means to avoid duplication and a better use of resources. And currently, DPGs are discussed as a means to help put the Sustainable Development Goals back on track, because sadly, it doesn't look like we are going to achieve them by 2030. So DPGs can be one means to help reach these goals actually in time. And the UN estimates that around 70% of the Sustainable Development Goals rely on digital solutions. So how can DPGs help? And with this, I would like to pass it on to my panelists. Sunita and Katharina. UNICEF and BMZ are both board members of the Digital Public Goods Alliance, an alliance that supports the investment in, discoverability of, and the use of digital public goods, specifically focusing on low and middle income countries. How do you see DPG's role in tackling global crises such as the climate crisis and digital and social inequality? And what is your role in the DPG ecosystem?
Yeah, maybe let me start with a little reminder. Some of you might still remember the COVID-19 crisis that hit the world very suddenly. And when the pandemic struck, governments around the world tried to help their people as quickly as possible with financial support and emergency payments. And some countries actually were able to help their people within weeks with the funds, and could help millions of people within weeks, and others took months or even didn't do it at all, sent money to the wrong people or accidentally excluded people that were in need of financial support. So let us look at a very positive example in this case, which is Togo. It might surprise you a little bit. They have established a digital platform for emergency cash transfer, and so they could reach people that didn't even have a bank account, just by sending them money on their mobile devices so they were able to pay again. And in other words, this digital platform is nothing else but a digital public infrastructure that helped. And they chose the individuals eligible for social transfer payments based on algorithms, supported and based on artificial intelligence, and plus high-resolution satellite images, for example, to identify those remote areas where people most likely were in need of support. So, but on the other hand, 850 million people around the world still do not have official proof of their identity. So basically, they do not exist at all for their governments. And 1.4 billion people still do not have a financial account. So what is our role as the ministry? In Germany, actually, it sometimes seems we have been promoting silo solutions over decades within our federal system. But by this, we have learned it the very hard way. Reinventing the wheel over and over again is not at all efficient. This is why we, as BMZ, believe in open source software and digital public goods as a basis for building digital public infrastructure. So, open and secure DPI is a priority for German development cooperation and an important field of action also on the new strategy for international digital policy of the German government as a whole. And practically we do two things. On the one hand, we use international cooperation to lobby worldwide for a strong digital ecosystem. The Digital Public Goods Alliance, of course, is a very important platform in this context. And on the other hand, with our global initiative, the so-called GovStack initiative, we create a common framework for reusable and interoperable digital components, so-called digital building blocks needed for digital government services. So by following this GovStack approach, digital services can be built much faster and at considerably less cost, while guaranteeing all components are interoperable. And let me just give you one example, because it works two ways, our initiative. With Ukraine, we are collaborating on the back end behind the famous DIA app. Many of them might have heard of it. Ukrainian people don't carry around any documents and don't go to their authorities' offices, but they have everything they need, all documents, all papers within the DIA app. So we are cooperating them on the so-called DIA engine, which is a registry of registries behind the DIA app. And the goal is to develop an open source prototype based on the DIA engine. And this prototype will be GovStack compliant and then can be shared as digital public good with third countries to digitize their registry systems as well.
Thank you so much, Katharina. What is UNICEF's take?
So maybe just, apologies for my voice, which I've been losing since last night. Maybe just a quick reminder for those of you who are not so familiar with UNICEF. UNICEF is the world's largest organization focused exclusively on children. We sit within the UN system, work in some shape or form in all countries around the world, and really our mission is to support every child, so making sure that children around the world have all the essentials and their rights realized. And so for us, technology and digital solutions and digital innovation, we see that as really a key driver to helping us fill those gaps and meet the needs that we still see. So Leah spoke a little bit about the fact that we're falling way short and way behind the Sustainable Development Goals, and what we're really seeing at UNICEF is trying to leverage and look at how some of the really rapidly evolving technology that we're seeing, how we can leverage them in a safe way to support our efforts, our partners' efforts to reach every child with what they need. So UNICEF was part of the small group of organizations that back in, I guess, 2018 or so, looked at really shaping this concept of digital public goods. The idea was to say, how can we not only emphasize the what kind of solutions do we need to fulfill some of the needs that Katharina talked about, not just in emergencies, but on an ongoing basis, but how do we actually design these solutions in a way, in the right way? So really emphasize the how. How do we make these solutions universally accessible? How do we make them available? How do we design them and deploy them in a way so that local ecosystems, local markets get grown, and so that technology doesn't further and widen the gap that we're already seeing, but can actually close it as well. And that we can redistribute the benefits of digital and the digital economy across people, communities, and countries that may otherwise be excluded. And so for us, that's really where we saw the value of digital public goods. Now, what do we do very concretely? One of the very concrete and specific initiatives that we have is our venture fund. We support entrepreneurs in developing and emerging markets to develop their solutions as open source solutions with the aim of becoming digital public goods and meeting the standard that the DPG Alliance has set for these solutions. You'll hear from Antonella about her product shortly, but another example, for instance, is a company out of Malaysia that we've supported called Thinking Machines that have developed an AI-based data platform that gives insights into where there are pockets of inequalities, of wealth inequalities, for instance, that exist using satellite imagery, mobile network operator data, and other things. And what we've seen is, because it's open source, we've been able to scale that solution very quickly to 10 plus countries around the Southeast Asia region. So UNICEF operates at this very early stage of trying to identify entrepreneurs and support them, but at the same time working closely with governments in 130 plus countries to actually use those solutions as part of systems that try to meet the needs of children.
Great, thank you so much. And one of the startups that you back is Antonella's startup. So over to you, Antonella. Why did you choose to adapt an open source approach to your product? And where, I mean, there are benefits to it, and you will tell us about this, of course, but where do you also see challenges in the DPG ecosystem?
Great. Okay, why open source? We are working in blockchain, and we have been developing products for the last 5 years. And there is a saying, don't trust, verify. So there is no way for us to be able to scale and build solutions in blockchain if it is not open source. And not even imagine working with the government of Argentina as we did, or the national university, or multinational institutions. So for us, it's a must, but we understand the benefits. We have been building the first crypto wallet that is DPG, that is a Web3 non-custodial crypto wallet, but then we continue building upon that. We partnered with banks and allowed people to have their first credit card, and we included a lot of people in the financial system, and we're helping always with our solutions to close the financial or to work towards the financial inclusion, also social inclusion. We understand that there are many benefits. One of the benefits is like you build very quickly and fast. For example, this year we are developing a solution merging 5 or 7 different open source solutions that allows us within 4 months to go and pilot it very fast, how to send money to people who doesn't have smartphone or internet. That if we couldn't use open source solutions out there, it would have been unthinkable because of the cost and the time. So this interoperability of different open source solutions could be a challenge that we have to change them because they were not working very well, so that's a good point to work on. But the thing that it's there, available, and the open source community is building, it's making it most robust, is a very important point to consider in open source solutions. Also, the funding is a bit challenging in this sphere, but not only that, also keeping a community that is engaging and developing upon other open source solutions.
Thank you so much. I think that was already super insightful in terms of giving us pointers for the rest of the discussion. So we will come back to the challenges later on when we talk about actionable items, basically, at the end of the session. Before I'm going to do that, I would like to take it a level higher, so to say, and look at the international level, at the international processes that are currently going on. And you already mentioned digital public infrastructure, Katharina, and what we can observe now really is that there's a great momentum around digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. And that is also due because digital public infrastructure is a term that gained a lot of attention during the last G20 presidency of India. They really coined this term, meaning digital public infrastructure in the sense of horizontal technical infrastructure that's such as data exchange, digital ID solutions, and instant payments that really drive countries' digital service delivery, but can also help to build markets. And obviously digital public goods, so open source technologies, play a huge role in that as well, because some of the core products really that are used in DPI implementations currently are open source products. And that's where the DPG angle comes in again. And both of these terms are also very relevant beyond the G20, of course, namely in the Global Digital Compact. What is the Global Digital Compact? It's an international policy document that is currently negotiated between UN member states, and its results will basically form the foundations for digital cooperation and the future of the internet in the more or less in the next decades, we could almost say. So it goes much beyond the Agenda 2030, which will end in 6 years, but will really shape how we will interact in the digital sphere. So what we really see is that the Global Digital Compact offers a great momentum to bring in digital public goods and also digital public infrastructure. And just quickly where we stand with this, before I will pass it on for more of an explainer where we stand and what is the potential, but what are also the stumbling blocks. So there's currently the first revision of the Global Digital Compact. There are multi-stakeholder processes ongoing. And the final Global Digital Compact is going to be presented at the Summit for the Future in New York in September. So there's still a bit of time, but not a lot of time, to make sure that DPGs are well anchored in this document. And maybe we can take a step back, and Katharina, you can help explain a little bit more the relevance of the Global Digital Compact for international cooperation and international development, and also shed a little light on which hopes are tied to it.
Thanks, yes. Of course, you know, the Global Digital Compact will be a voluntary and non-binding document, so there's no legislation behind it. But still, I think it will set the scene for our digital future and will surely leave its footprints in digital transformation worldwide. So still, though it's not non-binding, and so, yeah. And still, it's the first framework on digital cooperation. This is one thing we should point out as well. And it will certainly also impact other processes around digital transformation as well. So from our point of view, what we advocate for generally is that digital public infrastructure is, of course, adequately reflected within the Global Digital Compact and in the final framework, and that it recognizes the fundamental role that DPI has for creating fair and inclusive global economy. But if you look at the latest version of the draft, the first revised version, then you can see that in a document of about 14 pages, the subchapter on DPI and DPG is about 1 page. So I think we can be very satisfied at the moment, but you know, these negotiations are still going on. And I think there's a good worldwide momentum right now, not only in the discussion of DPI and DPG, but also with a link with AI being discussed everywhere. And so there's a new momentum because now we are also discussing DPI and digital public goods combined with artificial intelligence. And I think this might be a good chance to further promote the DPI and DPG idea.
Thank you so much. A lot of different stakeholders engage in the process. One of them is UNICEF, of course, as a multilateral organization. Can you tell us a bit more about the roles of different stakeholders, but also about what UNICEF is advocating for when it comes to the Global Digital Compact, and especially from a venture fund perspective, Sunita?
Sure. So we're unfortunately already in the stage of the process where it's very difficult for anyone who's not a government to really shape the document directly. So there's been an extensive consultation process where different stakeholder groups were allowed to make submissions, written or oral. There's been kind of a build-up actually for like a year and a half or something now in terms of framing that first draft of the text. And so there were a lot of opportunities to engage. I would say at this point in time, the way to engage is to become really good friends with whoever's sitting at the negotiating table within your own governments. Katharina might be one of those people. And sort of make sure that those groups take forward the messages that are important to whatever group or stakeholder group that you're representing. The second piece, which I think shouldn't be underestimated, is what happens after, right? It's a document, and it really is, that's what it is. It will hopefully rally and align the way that different stakeholders and different partners are engaging on these questions of digital transformation, but what happens after is the critical part. So that's where the diverse set of stakeholders, civil society is really important in making sure that we hold each other and others to account for what we've, in theory, committed to do. And I think looking at that document and seeing how we can align our own practices is really critical as well at this point in time. So one of the things that we've been calling for is the focus on digital public goods. And I think while, yes, we have seen that there is considerable space dedicated to it, we've actually, over the last 3-4 months, seen that that language has been diluted. And so this idea that you have to come to a consensus and you have to come to an agreement across people who are shaping these documents has become very evident. We were very pleased with the first version. We're a little less pleased with the second version. And so, you know, it's like an interesting thing to see how these things evolve. But is the call to, for instance, redirect funding. So one of the things that we emphasize from the venture fund's perspective is the need to build capacity and look at where funding is really flowing to make sure that digital is being built by, designed by, maintained by those communities who can really use it the most. So if we look at the numbers, most venture capital funding is still going to a handful of countries, mostly in the global north. If we look at which founders are getting most of the venture capital funding, depending on the numbers you look at, anywhere between 99 and 90% of funding is going to men. And so like these are some of the things that we as the fund want to see addressed. We want to be able to look at how we can really balance out some of those inequalities that we're seeing that are persistent. And then the second issue that UNICEF is strongly advocating for is around, of course, the safety of children online. And so we're actually quite pleased with the language that we're seeing there. The Global Digital Compact makes direct reference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and respecting all the rights that are enshrined there for children. And so that's the second area that we are pushing very strongly.
Great. So you mentioned female funders. One of them is sitting next to me here. So Antonella, what is your take on the Global Digital Compact? As a DPG product developer, what do you expect from such a policy document?
So firstly, we will be expecting digital public goods to be recognized and to be known as the benefits they have for sure, and also be selected upon other projects that are not. More funding for sure, not only from the government, grants, international, more people willing to build, more open source developers contributing to these projects. And also, as you were saying, they collaborate with the SDGs, so they have an impact purpose. So I would expect more projects with impact purposes to close the financial or to work toward financial inclusion. Like, for example, one of our projects, we heard firsthand one testimony of this guy who was from Peru, and after 19 years living in Argentina, he said, finally, after using what you have built, I feel Argentinian, because I was excluded. So when you're working with projects like that and seeing that you're changing families one at a time, but it's very rewarding. Also, I would expect more projects working toward closing the gap, the digital immense gap that we have. We don't have to go far away. Even in Argentina, if you move away from the capital, you will have lack of internet infrastructure, lack of smartphones, no smartphones. So I remember one pilot that we were doing, we partnered with the university to help female entrepreneurs to learn about personal finance. And we wanted to be there, but we couldn't because it was impossible for the distance. So we said, okay, they can use our application to test their knowledge, the professor will speak, but they said they didn't have enough storage to download an app. So we said, no problem, let's go and do a Google form. No, they don't have data, they don't have internet. Okay, but we're going to gather everyone in a municipality or school so they will have Wi-Fi. No, there is no Wi-Fi. So we ended up horrible printing all the material, they got the class, but we couldn't even be there as a webinar. So some parts of the country, some communities are like totally excluded. And even if you're not living there, you do not know what to build to reach them. So it's very, very important, and I would expect more projects working toward that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to not forget the people who actually stand behind all of these initiatives, all of these policy documents, because at the end of the day, that is what we are working towards, right? To help, to empower people to take charge of their own lives. And as we just explained, financial inclusion is a really remarkable tool to do so. So thank you for sharing also the story. We already heard from Sonita that you need to cozy up to your representatives of your country to make changes now to the Global Digital Compact. Which leads me to the question for you, Katharina, what the role of the member states is actually in such international processes. And also what priorities does the BMZ have and which they feed into such processes. So what is it that you are aiming for? Which impact stories would you like to see realized?
Yeah, you're right. Apart from the Global Digital Compact, there are also other international processes and discussions ongoing, and for example, within the G20. And these priorities, what is most important, or one of the most important points for Germany and for the BMZ, is to maintain and foster a multi-stakeholder approach. Because we actually believe that civil society, the private sector, the technical community, including especially from the Global South, of course, must be involved in all these processes on international digital policy. And this is something that we continuously advocate, and so does the federal government as a whole. As I mentioned before, the federal government just published their first international digital strategy, and this strategy also highlights that we support, first of all, the creation of digital public goods within the framework of the UN, but also the strategy highlights our German commitment to the multi-stakeholder approach. And what are our further priorities when it comes to digital transformation? I think, first of all, to us, like for all of you, I hope digital transformation and digitalization is not an end to itself, but it serves and it is a powerful tool to advance the sustainable development goals, as you mentioned also before. And we are aiming at a socially equal, ecological digital transformation, and bridging the digital gender gap is one of our main priorities. I would just like to keep it at that.
Thank you. So obviously different stakeholders have different priorities for such a process. And we heard about the hopes that are tied to the GDC, right? As a document, a high-level document that is going to shape digital cooperation over the next decades. And when we talk about hopes, we also need to talk about stumbling blocks, I'm afraid, especially when it comes to such international processes. The Global Digital Compact is a document, as you might have heard, that is consensus-based, right? So everyone needs to agree to the text at the end of the day. And of course, this also leads to a lot of critique in the sense of, okay, if this is consensus-based, then we probably won't have a brave document that is laying out the principles for a bright digital future based on human rights and responsibility and fairness. It's more the little common denominators that we are landing on, and probably a watered-down version of what different stakeholders would like to see in this final document. Sunita, maybe you can tell us a bit more your view on that. What do you tell critiques of the GDC process?
Yes, to all of that. So yes, consensus has its limitations. I would say, though, that some of the things that you just flagged, in terms of, for instance, human rights-based approach, actually the compact is pretty strong. And so maybe some of the areas that, depending on who's around the table, can maybe be a bit more controversial. I think in this particular document, we're actually seeing some quite strong language come through. I would also just say, maybe coming back to the point I was making earlier, is that the document's really just the starting point. And sometimes these deliberations where we are trying to get to I'm not in the room, but where member states are trying to get to a consensus, can actually help flag what are some of those questions, what are some of those tough areas, what are some of those areas where we don't agree and don't align. And they provide then the basis for work in the future. Because they don't go away. Those challenging areas and those tough questions don't go away just because they're not reflected in the document. They will emerge when it comes to translating that at the country level, or translating that into, as Katharina already mentioned, legislation in country and approaches in country. So I think it can be still a very enlightening way to kind of reach the document, because it does give the opportunity to surface some of those. Another concern I have is just, having worked within the UN system for a little while now, is the ability to really be forward and future looking. So I think what this document needs to do is already lay the groundwork for what the world is going to look like in 5 to 10 years down the road. And my bigger fear is that this document is responding to what the world is like now. It's not, and that in and of itself is a struggle. It's not really preparing us for what the world is going to look like in 10 years' time. When AI is going to be doing a whole lot more than it already is and shaping our lives, when connectivity actually is going to be significantly more accessible. So, the examples that you gave, the pushback we often get is, you're not designing for people who don't have a phone or don't have connectivity. It's like, well, but if you project out 5 or 10 years down the line, a lot of those people actually will. And so how are we preparing for the world that looks very different and that we really struggle to imagine? And I think that is a fear that I tend to have when it comes to kind of those sorts of documents and the people who sit around the table, including my own organization and its ability to really imagine the world and what the world will be like for children, in 10 years' time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think many organizations struggle actually with the ability to project into the future. So I guess what the UN system also needs to learn here is this agility that is needed to actually be forward-thinking and react when the world is changing. So maybe it's also not anymore the right thing to do to work on a consensus-based document for 3 years and then use it for the next 30 years as a basis for digital cooperation and deliberations. Probably also means that we need to revisit all of those core documents much more regularly to ensure that it actually reflects how the world is looking like at this stage. One thing that you mentioned is artificial intelligence, of course. It's one of the big topics that is on top of mind for everyone. And of course, it's also part of the Global Digital Compact. And not only that, the UN also just recently adopted a resolution on artificial intelligence for sustainable development, where also a little paragraph was on open source AI, which made me quite happy, to be honest. And of course, from a DPGA perspective, AI DPGs are very important. We also work with UNICEF and a community of practice to define AI DPGs and to also help accelerate and discover more of them. But I also know that the BMZ has a flagship program on open source AI. Katharina, can you tell us a bit more about how open source AI is currently reflected on the Global Digital Compact, but also why this is such an important topic for the ministry?
Yeah, I think when you just look at a newspaper, just a random one at the moment, you won't find at least, I'd say, 2 or 3 articles which are not linked with the topic of artificial intelligence. So, and the same goes for the political discussions right now. So, this discussion on AI is very dynamic at the moment. It happens at just all levels, and of course, it's also a very relevant topic for us, and not just now, but it has been for years already. And the GDC aims, of course, to bring together the threads and loose ends of these many international ongoing processes, but it's I think, too soon to speak about the role of AI-specific digital public goods, and in the Global Digital Compact, the negotiations are still going on. But in our work, as I just said, we already support AI DPGs within our so-called Fair Forward initiative. All Fair Forward applications are open AI models and target particularly government services. Concretely, we improve access to open and inclusive training data, such as language models and open source AI applications for local innovation. So stakeholders from government and civil society in our partner countries can access and benefit without financial barriers. And why is this essential? Have you ever tried to use ChatGPT in a language other than English, maybe German or French, and tried it maybe in a local African language? Or did you try to ask Siri a question in maybe Kiswahili? If she understands you at all, the results will likely not be so great as in English or German. And that's why we develop open AI training datasets in local languages, such as Kinyarwanda, this is the Rwandan language, and Kiswahili, spoken by more than 150 million people. In this way, AI can be accessible for a diverse range of communities and can even help illiterate people to operate, for example, voice-operated devices. So just to give you an example.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, a really powerful example, because human-machine interaction will rely much more on voice interaction, especially when it comes to populations that don't know how to read and write, or that come from an oral culture. So I think that's a really impressive initiative that BMZ supports there. When it comes to AI and AI DPG, there's not only the Global Digital Compact, there's also the current G20 discussion led by the Brazilian presidency, which also is discussing open source AI as an alternative to proprietary solutions to enable especially global majority countries access to the technology and to also counter global power imbalances. So even if it's not well reflected in the GDC, I would say, at least from my perspective, that there is still hope for this topic. In the last section, I would like to break it down now really to more actionable items. So we talked a lot about why DPGs are important, what are the benefits, why did you choose to adopt an open source approach, how is this reflected in global policy documents, and what does it mean for digital cooperation in the next years. But of course, it's important to move also from policy to practice. So how can we bridge this gap from documents to actual implementation? And concretely, I would like to ask you, Sunita and Antonella, how to tackle the sustainability and funding challenge, for instance, when it comes to digital public goods. And of course, that's a discussion that you also find in the open source community. Funding and sustainability and business models have always been a core topic of concern for many developers. But from an international cooperation perspective and the DPG perspective, what needs to be done to strengthen the ecosystem in this regard, also beyond venture funding, for instance?
So I think you've hit the nail on the head that in this case, when it comes to the sustainability question, it's the open source piece of DPGs that raises the biggest question marks or challenges. So as I mentioned before, a venture fund provides seed funding. It's equity-free seed funding to startups. We've got a portfolio now of 80 plus startups that have received that seed funding from the fund. And so it gives us a fairly reasonable data set to look at in terms of what that means when it comes to attracting other sources of funding, financial sustainability. And again, these are all solutions that are open source. They may not all be DPGs when they get funding from us, but the aim is to help them become digital public goods towards the end of their journey with us. And we often get this pushback by saying, oh, you're investing in open source solutions. That means you're expecting that company to be a charity, to give away their solution for free. There's no way of making money when you're open source, and all of that is just completely wrong. If you look at some of the really big, commercially successful software solutions, a number of which you are using probably on your phone or at home, a lot of them are actually open source, which you may or may not be aware of. Companies like Microsoft and others rely to a large extent on open source software to build their own products because it is more efficient for them to do so. And so that is, it's just a kind of false dichotomy, this idea that DPGs or open source solutions wouldn't be able to be financially sustainable. So what we've seen in our portfolio, which again is made up of solutions entirely developed by and built in developing and emerging markets, is that over 60% of those, even in very early stages, are generating revenue, and over 40% of those are actually profitable. So that's a pretty good track record that we're seeing given the stage of the company. And they attract more than 2.5 times the value that we've given them as seed funding from external parties. So that could be grant funding, it could be private investment, equity, debt, other sorts of financing instruments. So we're seeing that they are in fact attractive to investors that are looking for a financial return. And we see a lot of that reflected just in open software, in the open software business and industry in general. It's a $30 billion industry that's projected to grow about 18% year on year. So this is not a small thing that we're talking about. It's not an inconsequential side from a commercial kind of standpoint. So for us, it's really a matter of kind of dispelling those myths around sustainability. It's also about dispelling the myths around how innovative, how commercially successful, how competitive companies from developing and emerging markets are and can be. And that those founded by founders that tend to be underrepresented, that they're necessarily less competitive as well. So this is really the piece where we're seeing that there's a shift needed in terms of the rhetoric and the funding practices that we see, because it's really important to put kind of a completely different generation and a completely different set of people in charge and empower them to be able to design the digital future that we're all looking for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
I will add to that, just to stress or highlight that even if you're open source, you generate revenue, like Sunita was saying. But funding is a lot of work in startups, and not only from venture capitals, but only from governments. We have received plenty from the Argentinian one. And it would be good putting into practice this, like to make it a requirement to be DPG, to be open source. I think what UNICEF Venture Fund did, like it is a requirement to get funded. It's very intelligent because it pushes the teams to think harder. How do we do it open source and work and have revenue? So making it a requirement, it's a good idea. Also opening new lines of grants from governments, from international organizations, blockchain, there is a lot of grants. So that's an important part. And also to help sustainability of these kind of projects, something that meant a lot to us is when we got funding from UNICEF Venture Fund, because it's more than the money. There are many aspects, but they are trusting you and they are capable. So whenever we went to government or banks, we had like someone backing us, and that was different. So we were a blockchain company creating things in crypto, helping society in general, and that helps also when a government or an institution supports a startup, helps attracts more funding. We closed a Canadian VC after we received funding from UNICEF. Other angel investors were more willing to invest in our startup. Also the team members, how to attract talent. It helps, everything helps to sustainability. And one important thing that I think I don't know if we mentioned, but the first time we received the funding, it was in crypto. And we are from Argentina, so we had a lot of problems. And at that time, receiving dollars from the outside would have meant for us to lose half of the funds if we had received dollars, because of the political situation at that time. So when we heard that we could receive 100% of that in crypto, we said, yes, totally, give it to me. And it was amazing, because emerging markets have some challenges, and it's important to highlight that specific point.
Thank you so much. So funding, sustainability, these are some of the issues. Also, like making this work in emerging markets, not only in global north markets. So that's another aspect, which I think is super important. What we've also heard about is interoperability of different open source solutions, different DPGs, and accessibility in terms of making sure that the right people actually also find products that are open source to use them in their own digital transformation efforts. Katharina, what is BMZ doing in this regard to strengthen the DPG ecosystem when it comes to interoperability, scalability of products, but also ensuring that knowledge is shared around implementations. Because of course, the idea around digital public goods and open source is also that you don't need to reinvent the wheel, but you're actually standing on the shoulders of others and learn from each other.
Yeah. I think most of all, international cooperation is key, because we have now so many different initiatives and international processes and discussions on DPI and DPG. Sometimes it really feels like they are competing approaches, but I think we have to join forces internationally so that we all together can make progress in this context of DPGs and DPIs. So when we are really convinced that the groundwork for digital transformation is created far more quickly via DPGs and DPI at reasonable cost and fairly, meaning with respect for human rights, privacy, and the needs of the most vulnerable people, then we really have to join forces. And I think we who are trying to leverage the potential of both DPG and DPI on a daily basis tend to think that we have found the one and only answer, so to say, the 42 of digital transformation worldwide. But actually the truth is, and Antonella also already mentioned it, DPGs and DPI alone are not the answer. And one DPG might actually not work together with another DPG, though they are both open source, because they can't communicate with one another, or with proprietary commercial software also. So let me give you one of my really favorite examples, also from the COVID-19 pandemic. You might know that German authorities first struggled a lot with tracing contact people, contact persons of patients that were infected with the coronavirus, and monitoring the spread of the virus and the disease in general. So here comes SORMAS, also a digital public good and a software supporting the monitoring of diseases and helping to take the right measures to fight the further spreading of infection. And the point is, SORMAS was originally funded by my ministry because it was developed in Nigeria in the context of Ebola. And in my eyes, this is a perfect example for reverse learning at its best. Theoretically, that should work in Germany as well, but because SORMAS was rolled out to, and though SORMAS was rolled out to the most German public local health authorities, several of them simply could not work with it and not benefit from the software because the data exchange with the systems already installed would just not work due to a lack of compatibility. So I think, metaphorically spoken, what we really need for DPI and DPGs is plug-and-play solutions. So just like with your smartphones, and you have a drawer stuffed with several chargers, with several different plugs. What we are aiming at with GovStack is providing the construction plan of a universal charger, just like we have it with smartphones now with the USB-C charger. So if all DPGs could be powered on with this compatible charger based on an international standard, it would become much easier for various actors to create more complex digital services consisting of several building blocks. So therefore, we should ensure that as many institutions as possible provide their solutions directly with the necessary interoperability standards to ensure DPG and DPI are scalable. So this is why international cooperation is key, and this is why dialogue formats like right now, the GovStack Digital Leaders Forum held this week at the World Summit on Information Society in Geneva are so vital, because there we highlight best practices in the context of open source and can learn from one another.
So increased operability for digital public goods, that's one of the key takeaways here. It sounds like a bold vision, to be honest. But at least from sectoral approaches, we know that it actually can work. I mean, just looking at the digital health sector, for instance, there are standards such as FHIR, and a lot of products actually build on that standard, which helps to really tackle the defragmentation. But what we really need, what I heard from you, is that we have this at a broader scale, basically being sector agnostic. So let's see about that. That could be probably one outcome, actionable outcome of the Global Digital Compact, or a common initiative by some of the DPG ecosystem champions, which are sitting here on stage. So let's see, the last word is not spoken here. The last word is also not spoken here on stage, but I would like to also open it up here for you now in the audience. We have around 10, let me check, 5 to 10 minutes time for a quick Q&A. So if there are questions, please stand up and make yourself heard.
Hello, my name is Sabine Muscat. I'm an independent consultant also working on global digital cooperation. And thank you very much for this very engaging panel. I really enjoyed it and applaud your engagement and your work on this issue. Very, very, very helpful and necessary. I think one topic that we haven't touched upon was security, and I would just like to put that out there, like data security, data protection, but also the environment in which certain digital public infrastructures are then being used. I'm just thinking of digital IDs, and oftentimes there are a lot of controversial discussions about the application of those when I think about examples in Kenya or India, and I would just be very interested in your comments on that, also related to funding, like who funds the maintenance, the updates, and who makes sure that everything is being done securely. Thank you.
Thank you for this great question. Who on the panel feels obliged to answer?
Maybe I would just go ahead and start, and maybe then you could also highlight your points. Of course, security is a cross-cutting topic, also within our initiatives. And as I mentioned, the GovStick initiative before, it is at the core of the initiative that with basic modules such as e-identity, we also define certain standards and specifications. And of course, privacy and security are among the most important standards. So I think we're trying to really engage these standards from the very beginning, from scratch, and also try to promote these standards over all the different modules that we are trying to define within the GovStick initiative. So we're trying to make sure these standards are really then also met. But of course, we never can guarantee that everybody who is using the GovStack standard and the GovStack building blocks really respects this. But we just hope and we try our very best to make sure they do.
I can also just complement this maybe as a moderator. There's also the UN DPI Safeguards Initiative, and they are doing amazing work to ensure that there are safeguards for fair and inclusive digital public infrastructure in place. That's another ongoing effort of the UN Tech Envoy currently. It's a multi-stakeholder process in terms of that there are working groups and then there are consultations for the DPI safeguards framework, which is also going to be tested with countries who are interested in that and also presented at the Summit for the Future in New York. So I think there's a lot of awareness around that. Even if DPI delivered so well during the pandemic, we need to take now the steps that we didn't have the time to take back then to ensure that this is actually infrastructure that is built in safely and inclusively. And what this will look like potentially is some form of checklist or some form of risk framework that you can go through, and you have different stages of the DPI lifecycle and then different processes, principles, and standards that implementing organizations, implementing partners, stakeholders in the whole ecosystem of DPI can take to ensure it's safe and inclusive. And this also includes, of course, those that are not implementing, but those that are affected by digital public infrastructure. And the German Development Corporation is represented in this effort as well. And I think UNICEF might be in a multi-stakeholder consultation group as well, if I'm not mistaken. There was another question. Yes. ideally, that is a short question and a short answer, because we need to wrap it up soon.
Thank you very much. My name is Marcel Dorsch. Lea, you just mentioned the DPI Safeguards Initiative. I'm also working on the GDC for 1.5 years now, and I have the perspective more on the environmental sustainability perspectives within the GDC, and I just wondered whether you could just elaborate a little bit more on a safeguards perspective in this regard, to include and anticipate environmental risks of digital technologies, digital public infrastructures, digital public goods, also in the development context, whether this is more another burden, right, to be even more normative correct and perfect in a sense, or whether you see chances and options and opportunities to really mainstream this perspective as well. Because often, and that's a personal perception, is that the digital public infrastructure discourse is still very materialistic. So digital is not really materialistic in any sense. So there's no resource footprint, for example, no energy footprint, nothing like that. It just helps. It's virtual. But this, of course, as most of we are aware of, is not the case. That's my question. And tomorrow there will be Amandeep Gill, the tech envoy, at 3:00 p.m. in the stage 3, for those who are interested.
Big question, short amount of time. Who wants to answer this?
Well, of course, you're perfectly right. We're just talking about how important digital instruments are, but we're not talking about their carbon footprints. And especially when it comes to artificial intelligence, this is a huge problem, actually. So this is why we are trying to bring together both aspects, sustainability on the one hand, and digitalization on the other hand, which is called the twin transition approach. So I think at the BMZ we are also already trying this. For example, together with the World Bank, we have a framework for green digital centers, because everybody knows, especially data centers, need a lot of energy just to cool the servers. And this is, of course, vital, and data centers are vital for digital transformation, but it's also vital that they can be sustainable, and so that you try to use renewable energies to cool the servers in data centers. This is just one example, but I think we have this in mind, and we are also already trying to fight this problem and to make digitalization green and help also via digital tools to improve climate protection. It works both ways around, but of course we're still, as a whole, at the very beginning, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think these issues are also already addressed. Not finally solved, but already addressed.
Thank you so much for this answer. We need to wrap it up in a few minutes, and I would like to take the opportunity of the last 3-4 minutes to ask my panelists about one key takeaway that should stick with the audience here after the session. What is it that you want to highlight?
I would say related to open source and digital public goods, to really understand the power and the benefits, you have to live it firsthand as a business owner, as if you are a developer, for example, until you do not do the first pull request to modify a public repository of a library that you use every day, or many uses, and they accept that change, until that moment, you cannot understand how your collaboration, how your contribution is collaborating with the wider intelligence.
I think for me it's about the willingness to take a long-term approach when it comes to digital. So very often, because the digital world moves so quickly, we think that like the quick fix is also the right way to go. Whereas if we look at kind of the approach around digital public goods and the need to address power imbalances and transfer power, those things take time, and they involve building capacity, they involve questioning how we're doing things, letting money flow in different ways. And often, for some reason, when it comes to digital and when it comes to innovation, we often sort of neglect that longer-term view. That might be the harder road, but will bring the more sustainable results in the long term.
So patience.
Yeah. And maybe a little plug that for those of you who'd like to continue the conversations with us, you're welcome to join us at a reception, just in the reception area near the entrance gate, where we'll continue having these chats.
Yeah, I think first of all, I wish it wouldn't be so hard and sometimes complicated to explain the principle of digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. That's what to start with, and maybe you have understood it a little bit more than before, if you haven't known it before. And then, Antonella, when you were talking about the private sector, then I wish they would more and more understand, and I think we are still at the beginning, that open source and digital public goods and digital public infrastructure is not a competing approach, but and they don't have to think that we are trying to ruin their core business, but it's complementing each other. And so there's no use at all to reinvent the wheel forever and ever and ever, but we can help each other, and there still remains a lot of work to do and a lot of business models that can be taken over by software companies.
Thank you so much for this insightful discussion. I think this was really exciting and I hope also helpful for the audience. We're going to stick around here somewhere a little bit more if you want to chat about DPGs, and if you want to hear more about the GDC, as Marcel already mentioned, there's tomorrow's session with the UN Tech Envoy and the Foreign Office, where they do a deep dive into the whole process and the outcomes perspective of the document. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for your attention.